Hi on the Empathic channel. Understanding freedom is not that obvious as many may think. It goes way beyond a simplistic notion of mere absence of physical constraints. As Nelson Mandela declared, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." To understand freedom is to be an advocate of freedom, and to live with the values that represent freedom. In this video, we will go through the most important events in human history that created our freedom today. Looking through the perspective of history greatly expands the understanding of what freedom is, why it should be cared for and respected, and how to live to be an active contributor to freedom. We will go through milestones in human history that created free world that we live in, but is that even fair to say? Point number 1. Let's start with ancient times. Unfortunately, the history of man is the history of enslavement, the ideas of equal laws, or even the abolition of the institution of slavery are very new. We can enjoy them for around 100 years. Slavery arose when people began to form more complex communities. When agriculture era started and people began to accumulate supplies, possessions, or property. Before that, in nomadic tribes, we lived from day to day just hunting and gathering food. The year 10,000 BC is conventionally accepted as the beginning of the agricultural era. Back then, people caught in battles or wars between tribes, who were not killed, were later used as slaves mainly to cultivate the earth. There is no exact data here because we do not have enough sources. But slavery was in the first civilizations one of the most important points of building these civilizations. Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and Rome, slavery was common there and played a major role in building these civilizations and their economies. Estimates of historians are as follows. The largest percentage of slaves was in ancient Greece. It was about 1/3 of the population. Then Rome, 20 to 30% of population. It turns out that although the escape from Egyptian slavery is described in Bible, according to historians, Egypt was not the pioneer of slavery. We just think so because of the presence of this event in movies, cartoons, and books. Rome and Greece, although they were later, had far more slaves than Egypt. Of course, it wasn't that there were only slaves. In these civilizations, there was also a class of free workers who offered their labor, worked for money or various goods like grain or food. Slaves had no rights. They were the property of their masters, who had power over their life and death. They had no inheritance or marriage rights. The master, for example, in the form of punishment, could sell children or separate slave families. Point number 2. The collapse of the Roman Empire in 476 brought a major social change. The institution of slavery almost disappeared from Europe. It was replaced by feudalism, that is, the so-called serfdom. The spread of the Christian religion had a big impact on this. Simply according to Christianity, people should be equal, and slavery was no longer acceptable. Still, the social system consisted of a very strong hierarchy, ruled by monarchs and the people around them, who granted land in return for loyalty. Labor was no longer done by slaves, but by serf peasants, who were attached to the land, not to their lord. Peasants had more rights. They could participate in many social areas, for example, in religious ceremonies, and there was no slave trade. So the Christian doctrine can be said to have mainly influenced the reduction of slavery and next steps towards freedom. Point number 3. Magna Carta. Monarchs had absolute power in Europe. They give and took both land and life at their own judgment and discretion. This eventually began to create public opposition. Magna Carta is a document signed in 1215 by King John in England. These were the days of Robin Hood. That's a good way to imagine that period. Barons, nobles, and landowners forced this document on the King John. For the first time, it was ruled that no one, even the king, is above the law, and even the king is subject to the law. Magna Carta started the concept known today as the rule of law, which started to spread across the world slowly. Magna Carta said that justice should not be denied to anyone, nor should it be delayed, that trials should be fair and accessible to all. These concepts from Magna Carta are central of today's legal system. Magna Carta is one of the most important events and the most important document in the history of human rights. It became a symbol for later contributors to the development of human rights. Point number 4. Colonial Times, the return of slavery and its massive expansion. When people learned to make more sturdy ships, after some time came the ideas of further expeditions to discover new lands. The era of colonialism began. It was around the 15th century. In 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered America. A colonial race began between powers such as Spain, England, France, the Netherlands, and Portugal. Everyone knew that time was of the essence here. The new colonies required a large labor force to develop the new lands, educate them in crops, or put workers in the mines. A new prosperous economy was created around the entire Atlantic, of which the slave trade became the main branch. There were a lot of trading ports in Africa where slaves were traded. Everyone knew that buying slaves was the way to wealth, or at least survival in the new colonies. The Caribbean and the Americas then became a vein of gold for the colonialists, the Caribbean being at that time the richest place on Earth. At first, captives captured during tribal wars were traded in these African ports, and later capturing someone for slavery became a very lucrative occupation, even for Africans themselves. This allowed traders to gain access to gunpowder weapons, textiles, and metal products from Europe. It is important to say that the African population was divided between those who opposed slavery and those who got rich from it. The slave trade in Africa had a major impact on the disintegration of African societies, the decline of labor on the continent, and the increase in intercommunal conflict. The Colonial Times lasted from the 16th century to the 19th century, in fact until 1863, when Abraham Lincoln abolished slavery with the Emancipation Act. Point number 5. Enlightenment. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a profound intellectual revolution called the Enlightenment took place in Europe. Thinkers and philosophers such as John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu developed theories about natural rights and individual freedom. They wrote works on governance, politics, and state establishments. Intellectual development during the Enlightenment is considered the main inspiration for the creation of the United States, the American Revolution, the American Constitution, and the French Revolution. Montesquieu and other thinkers created the concept of division of power into 3 instances, mutually controlling each other. The tripartition of power is to prevent the development of tyranny and dictatorship. It was applied during the construction of new nation-states and their systems. Point number 6. American Revolution, Declaration of Independence, formation of new governments. The ideas of the Enlightenment were used to create a new state and liberate itself from the rule of the British Crown. After battles between the colonialists and the King's Army, the U.S. was victorious, and the Founding Fathers created a new system, the Federal Republic, in which Congress, not the monarch, ruled. This was in 1776. Shortly thereafter, some 13 years later, the French Revolution broke out, a great rebellion against the monarchy class and the clergy. At that time, between 16,000 and 40,000 people from the aristocracy, monarchy, and clergy classes were killed. Unfortunately, the revolution did not succeed in establishing democratic rule as happened in the U.S. After 3 years of the French Republic, frustrated by the instability and chaos of the new government, returned to establish first the so-called directors, then the National Convention, and finally the empire with Napoleon as chief dictator. Nevertheless, the French Revolution ushered in huge changes in Europe, overthrew the feudal system, and every country now wanted a constitution defining the rights of the citizen and the relationship of the state to its citizens. Point number 7. Abolition of slavery in the United States. Civil War. In the States, a huge population conflict developed around slavery between people who were for and against it. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, an opponent of slavery, was elected president. The North-South War broke out in the States in 1861, and in 1863, Abraham Lincoln announced the abolition of slavery with the Emancipation Act. The act declared that from then on, all slaves were forever free. Later, the 13th Amendment banned slavery. The 14th guaranteed equal protection of all before the law, and the 15th in 1870 gave voting rights to African Americans as well. Then came the so-called Reconstruction era, in which black representatives began to be elected to government as well. Unfortunately, Jim Crow came to power, shot a huge backlash on blacks, created a lot of tactics to discriminate against blacks in the U.S., racial segregation, and in general, a huge development of racism. It wasn't until 1964 that the act that addressed racial segregation, the Bill of Rights, was established. Point number 8. Suffragette movements. Beginning in 1848, suffragette movements became active in the United States. Women did not have the right to vote in elections or property rights like men had. Society was strongly patriarchal. These movements later spread to Canada and Europe. Courageous women began to fight for equality and developed their social activism greatly, finally gaining the right to vote after decades in 1920. On September 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting women the right to vote. Later in England, the Full Franchise Act was promulgated in 1928, which is considered a moment of gender equality. In addition to these major countries, suffragette movements began around the world in New Zealand and Europe. They were an important moment in the history of society, which show what power the social collective has, how to assert their rights. These movements show the tremendous social spirit of those who fight for equal rights. Point number 9. The revolution of human rights in the 1960s in the States. Despite the fact that in the States Lincoln abolished slavery and in 1870 African Americans and blacks were granted the right to vote, there was a major social turnaround. This is referred to as the period of Jim Crow America, where, with the help of various legal and political combinations, the era of racial segregation in the U.S. took place. Blacks had separate schools, bus seats, restrooms, or stores. Famous is the incident with Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her bus seat to a white person. This incident and many others started the human rights revolution in the U.S., focusing on the fight against racism and segregation. The movement, led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, outlawing racial discrimination. In 1965, another milestone was the Voting Rights Act, eliminating barriers to African Americans exercising their right to vote. These developments profoundly affected society, changing American equality policy. Point number 10. Freedom today. This is not the end of the struggle for freedom in the world, perhaps not even the beginning. In much of the world to this day, there is no freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, or freedom to associate. Patriarchy still reigns in much of the world, and to this day, in many still countries, women have significantly limited rights relative to men. Because of the development of technology and the internet, we are today in the midst of a freedom of speech revolution, one might say. New questions arise as to where freedom of speech begins and ends, which can be practiced by anyone on the internet today. Despite the fact that the institution of slavery does not formally exist in many countries around the world, people are forced to do hard labor often just for food and shelter. The illegal trafficking of people from poor countries still exists, and many countries still have dictatorships and lawless unlimited rule by those in power. So what does it mean to understand freedom? In my opinion, it is first of all education. Education about what freedom is, guarding the tri-division of power and justice. It is to help those who have not experienced this freedom until today. Freedom is fragile and delicate. Freedom is tolerance and diversity. It is respect for the expression of one's beliefs, even if they differ from our own. Freedom is pluralism. Freedom is the foundation of life, and we all have a responsibility to maintain and respect it. Thank you for watching, and see you in other movies on our channel. Keep well.